So for all of you who are here with us live, I want to thank you for joining us today. Welcome you to Turnitin's webinar, How to Integrate AI Writing into Your Institutional Policy and Instruction. Quite a mouthful, but we are going to try to cover all parts of that title. Before anyone asks, I will let you know that this session is going to be recorded. We record all of our webinars, and for everyone who is registered, whether you attend live or not, you will receive a link to the recording as a follow-up to the session today, and you'll be able to access it there. For those of you who are here live, I appreciate your time and I hope you enjoy it. And for those of you watching the recording later, I hope I sound okay at double time. So let's dig in. First, let me tell you a little bit about myself so you know who's talking to you today. My name is Patti Smith. I'm the Senior Director of Customer Engagement at Turnitin. I've been here for about 7.5 years, done a number of things at the company. But the way that I like to describe my job here at the company is that I speak for and to educators around the world and advocate for students and teachers. Responsible for all of our training programs for integrity products, as well as the teaching and learning innovations team, which I'll be talking to you a lot about today as we're sharing some of our resources, as well as a number of other programs at the company. Before I came to Turnitin, I have just about 20 years of experience in education, all in the United States, mostly in secondary education, but with some experience as an adjunct professor in teacher preparation programs at the university level. My work in education has always centered around the areas of literacy and equity, as well as formative assessment and curriculum design, and feedback. All of those pieces funnel directly into my work at Turnitin on a day-to-day basis, and in fact, all have a place in our discussion today as we talk about AI writing tools. Before I go too far, I also want to thank my supporting team. I have a number of my colleagues joining me today, and they'll be manning the chat and the Q&A. In the event that we're not able to get a Q&A at the end, because we do have so much to cover today, they will be responding to questions along the way, sharing resources, and anything we're not able to address today during the session, whether it's live or in the chat/Q&A, we'll make sure to follow up with you afterwards to address questions there. We have a wonderful marketing team that'll be handling those responses, and we'll make sure that we get back to you. My colleagues today joining me are Karen Smith, Namrata Nanda, Ophelia Estrada, and Alexis Sipple. And I would be remiss if I did not also cite my source, because my friend Callan Rose down in Perth, Australia, created a version of this webinar several months back, and it served as the inspiration for today, and he graciously gave me permission to use some of his content. So I want to make sure to give him some credit today. Now, let's dig in to our topic, because as I said, we do have a lot to cover. I think it's important to always sort of ground us in Turnitin's mission so that you understand sort of where we sit inside this very lively discussion. The mission at Turnitin is to ensure the integrity of global education and meaningfully improve learning outcomes. Everyone at Turnitin takes this very, very seriously. It's at the heart of every decision we make and all that we are doing in terms of working directly with students and educators and institutions globally. For the folks like me at the company, there are a significant number of us who are former educators. This is in fact the reason we work here, because this mission is very central to our purpose, and we take it very seriously. And I think you'll see how it influences the conversation we're going to have today. The other piece I want to call your attention to today is who Turnitin is. Now, many of you are here today. You know us in the space of similarity and originality, which is where our legacy is. We've had a deep impact in that space for many years now. In fact, we're celebrating our 25th anniversary. But we also have a comprehensive assessment suite of products that are designed to meet learners where they are, providing them tools and experiences they need for success, and ensuring that every assessment maintains integrity at its core. And of course, we are talking about AI writing as a piece of both aspects, both integrity and assessment. And so all of these pieces sort of work together in this wheel that you see in front of you today. And you can see The functionality is wide and varied, from proctoring all the way to analytics, grading, and feedback, as well as sort of similarity, which many of you know us for, and of course, AI identification. With that in mind, let's turn our attention to our specific topic today. Again, I am a teacher by training, so I always like to start with my outcomes or objectives. So we're giving you a little bit of an outline today for what we hope to cover in this session. We're going to be talking about activating students' critical thinking skills, understanding when and how generative AI is being used in student writing, engaging with students about AI writing to define course and institutional expectations, and then really deeply exploring how AI tools and different instructional responses can work together to form a stronger approach to learning given the circumstances. Again, teacher by training, so I don't want to dive into any new topic without making sure that we're all aligned on some of the key terms we're going to be using today. So I like to start by defining our terms. Now, the first one, I strongly suspect many of you have some background in, because otherwise you probably wouldn't be here today. But you'll hear me throughout the presentation talk about generative AI or AI generative tools. And these are simply the tools that many of you have heard about, that it's a suite of tools that are designed to create content. They, of course, as you know, have this huge, massive set of data behind them, sort of all the world's knowledge, if you will. Although some of my AI scientists tell me that's somewhat questionable a claim. But what they do is they use that body of knowledge to create content, some of which can look human-like, which is a little disturbing for some folks. And we're still learning what that means. And then a subset of those tools, the AI writing tools, including ChatGPT and others that you may have heard of, are specific to creating writing. They create written text. And so that'll be a huge part of our topic today. Underlying AI generative tools or generative AI is something that you probably have heard of before as well, large language models, or sometimes called LLMs. Now, I'm no AI scientist. That is not my expertise at the company, but we do have a huge division of AI scientists who are, frankly, some of the smartest people I have ever encountered in my life. And they have been working on this problem for years now, long before ChatGPT was released. And they have given all of the rest of us at the company a sort of a crash course in some of this. And so just this week, my friend David Adamson, who's one of our artificial intelligence scientists, shared a structure or a framework for understanding large language models that I found really, really helpful. And so I asked him if I could share it in my session with you today, and he graciously agreed. So when David explains large language models, he compares it to creating a map. And so if you think of a map, in the world of large language models, related concepts would end up near each other on the map, as well as ways of expressing ideas about those concepts. So from David's perspective, the way that he talks about it is that if you imagine the way that the AI works, you pick a point on that map, pick your starting point. He likes to make his in Pittsburgh, where he calls his home. And then you put down a snowball and you push the snowball off. And the snowball goes along the sort of path of least resistance, the most likely path, and it gathers related concepts as it goes. And it grows and it grows and it grows until it finds a resting plate, and that's our output. That's what we would see from it. Now, when you see that output, if any of you have tried out ChatGPT, you know that you can put in additional information, provide more context, prod it in a particular direction. So he thinks of that as kicking the snowball. So if you kick that snowball once it's formed, it's now going to gather more and more ideas as it moves along the next most likely path. And that's kind of how large language models work to give us generative AI output. The last term that I really want to talk about, these two terms at the bottom of my screen here, are AI use and AI misuse. Now, We don't necessarily have to define these. I think they're pretty self-explanatory, but what I want to call out is that they're not the same. AI use is not automatically AI misuse. And so it's important that we start talking about and differentiating those two terms, because this technology has a very prominent place in our world, and it's potentially going to grow even more in the future. So we need to acknowledge that there is a difference between using these tools effectively, ethically, and misusing them. What constitutes misuse really is going to depend on the particular context. It's up to the institution, policy, instructor, particular guidelines of a department or a topic or even an assignment are going to help to decide what is use versus misuse, what is allowed and what is not, is going to be very contextual. So I'm not here to tell you what misuse is, but to help you understand that we have to differentiate between simply using these tools and misusing these tools. So I want to move into getting some feedback from all of you about what you're experiencing in this world of AI that's brought many of you here today. And so we want to talk a little bit about the idea of common challenges. One of the common challenges that we know that people are encountering is this question around institutional policy. So I want to start with the question, have you started integrating AI within your institutional policy? Now you'll see a QR code on the screen. You can scan that to respond. And my colleagues will also be popping this into the chat so that you can follow that link. And we're going to ask you to just answer the question yes or no in a little app, Slido. Some of you may be familiar with it, and then we'll take a look at your responses. There we go. Answers are still coming on. So I'm actually really happy to see how this is playing out. It looks like roughly 65% of you are saying yes, your institutions have started to integrate AI within your policy, with about 35% saying no. Now, I'm going to share some data with you in a minute, and this is a clear change. It's what we expected to happen, and this is wonderful news to see that people are moving quickly in this regard, because we know that it's a complex issue and that for some time, educators and institutions were sort of on their heels responding to this, and they didn't have a chance to get in front of it. But it looks like, based on our participants today, that we're starting to see a shift, and that is absolutely wonderful to see. This data that I'm sharing with you goes back a little bit more historically. In the spring, for example, we conducted a survey, or we're a partner in conducting a survey to ask where institutions, educators, and students were in their thinking about AI. And one of the things that stood out at that time that was really, really important is that of those surveyed, 97% of institutions did not have a policy around AI at that time. I'm not surprised to learn, especially in North America or the Northern Hemisphere, that over the summer and in the intervening time since this survey, institutions have pushed to add to their policy. And I think that's why you're starting to see a big shift here based on the numbers from all of you today compared to these that we had from the survey that was done earlier this year. At that time, 71% of instructors and administrators said that they had never used AI writing tools. Versus 51% of students who said that not only had they used them, but they would continue to use generative AI tools even if instructors and institutions prohibited it. So we picked these three statistics. There's a lot more information here, and you'll see there's a link here in the presentation, and I'm sure that my colleagues can share more information, and you can actually find this. We have a white paper on our website, and some of this other information can be found on the AI landing page on Turnitin's website, so that you can dig into some of this more deeply for yourself. But we called out these three data points specifically because I think they sort of give us an overall picture of where we find ourselves as educators, where policy is either not in place yet or perhaps not clearly defined, maybe not fully communicated yet, for those of you who do have it in place. And again, this is all happening in very real time, so things are changing rapidly. But we do see a big gap between instructors and administrators and students in terms of their use of and thinking about AI generative tools. So it helps us sort of build the picture of where we find ourselves instructionally in terms of the gaps and the use and how we need to respond to it. It definitely creates some urgency around the work that we need to do in helping to understand how to address AI in our classrooms and at our institutions. Now, one of the things that we want to talk to you about today is something I am incredibly excited to be able to share with you. We've in fact just launched this officially today. And it's a concept that we've been talking about for some time at Turnitin that is around a big picture of AI. Many of you are here today, and many of you have been concerned about the concept of AI detection. And as you know, Turnitin did release an AI indicator earlier this year, and we've seen an immense amount of usage of that. I'll share some data with you in just a second. But one of the big concepts that we have been talking about in all of our press releases and all of our thought leadership and all of our educational pieces is the idea that detection or identification of AI writing is only one piece of a much, much larger puzzle or a much, much larger picture. And so we worked to create a visual that would represent that idea. And that's what I'm able to share with you today. And of course, we'll share it in the chat, and it is available on social media and on our website. So this is what we call our AI puzzle. And the idea behind the puzzle, again, is to represent the broader picture surrounding AI writing tools and their impact in education today. And so you'll see that we have these beautiful little tiles that intersect as puzzle pieces, each of them representing different aspects of the full AI writing piece or picture or puzzle, and showing how they can intersect. So let me give you a little bit of a walkthrough of this resource so that you'll know when you check it out later how to actually navigate. So over here on this column, you see some large data points. You'll recognize these. Some of these we've already talked about in my presentation today. We also call out the fact that we know that even as AI generative tools are evolving and being refined, they continue to have a phenomenon known as hallucinations, where they just make up information. So we're calling that out here too, because we do think that is a big piece of this overall puzzle. But if you look at the puzzle itself, it's laid out in a color-coded system. So you'll see that the green tiles represent content and ideas that are most relevant for administrators. I say most because I think there's some relevance for everybody across this puzzle, but we've sort of categorized it by who we think it's most relevant for. Then this deep blue in the middle represents educators themselves and concepts that we think are critical for their work. And then finally, over here in this lighter shade of blue, you'll see concepts that are relevant to institutions and actions that institutions can take. So you'll see some of the concepts here. Obviously, we do start out with this idea of identifying AI writing. Notice we're not talking about use or misuse yet, because that's a judgment that's attached to it, and that's not what we're doing. We're simply giving insights about whether AI writing is present or not. And so that falls here. What is really, really cool about this puzzle, one of the things I'm most excited about, is that it's interactive. So when you access this puzzle for yourself, you'll see that on these tiles, there are these segues to deeper dives on each of these topics. So here you see the AI writing detection capabilities, and you can click in here and you'll find video content about Turnitin's AI writing detection and capabilities. Down here, you can see a glossary of terms. And again, you can click in here and get the full glossary. And as you move across the puzzle, you'll find that each of these tiles is linked to some deeper set of resources specific to that topic and that audience. Hopefully, what you're noticing is that down here at the bottom, we've left some blank puzzle pieces. Why? because AI generative tools are evolving so rapidly and developing so quickly that we know that there will be puzzle pieces that will be added to this picture over time. And we're leaving space for that because we know that it's going to be important to keep current with what's happening, with what changes, and respond accordingly. So we're leaving ourselves space down here for other areas that we know will emerge as important concepts and important pieces of the puzzle. I want to ask for feedback on it, but that probably is not manageable with over 500 participants. So I won't pause there, but I hope that you will share feedback with us once you have a chance to dig into it. I highly recommend this as a great starting place for exploring some of Turnitin's resources, because as I said, it serves as sort of a jumping off spot so that you can explore all of these resources, but they're all sort of networked right here for you at your fingertips, which is one of the things I think is most fascinating about the way that this is set up as an interactive puzzle. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about that indicator. So as you're all aware, Turnitin released our indicator way back in April, right? I'm losing track of my months. I believe that's right. Way back in April, we launched our AI indicator. But as I already alluded to earlier in our discussion today, the AI indicator is not a product of ChatGPT. ChatGPT was released in November of 2022. The work that our teams were doing is at least 2 years old at that point, and we're now nearly a year out from that. So this work has been going on for a very long time around all aspects of artificial intelligence, but certainly AI generative tools. That work has several years of history, and we were working toward this even before the release of ChatGPT. It is accessible via the similarity report. So if you're a Turnitin customer, you're familiar that whatever solution you're using, you have access to our similarity report, which captures sort of traditional concepts around academic integrity, around things like copy paste plagiarism, citation, how much similarity there is with other works. And so it's still there because those are still very important insights, obviously, around academic integrity, but we've added the AI writing indicator to this larger puzzle. Now, one thing I want to call out is that today, existing customers have access to the AI writing detection capabilities as part of their current license, as part of what we're calling our preview phase. However, it's really important to call out that as of January 1st, 2024, only customers licensing Turnitin Originality or Feedback Studio with Originality will have access to this feature. So that's a very critical change, and it's coming up. So we want to make sure that we highlight it for all of you. If you have not already had conversations with your account manager about that change and making sure that you're able to continue your access to the AI writing indicator, we absolutely encourage you to reach out to your account manager who can help you to find the right solution moving forward to make sure that you continue to have access to this absolutely critical functionality. So in the time since we released the AI writing indicator, Turnitin has reviewed 76 million, more than, that's what the plus sign indicates, more than 76 million papers for similarities to AI writing. Obviously, what that indicates is that there is a huge interest and a huge concern around AI writing tools. Of those 76 million papers, over 2.5 million were flagged as having at least 80% AI writing present. 2.5 million papers, 80% of those papers, AI writing present. And nearly 8.1 million were flagged as having over 20% AI writing present. We share these numbers with you to help understand the context around where we find ourselves today. What these numbers tell us is on the one hand, there's a lot of interest around how much AI writing is being used. That's what the review of those over 76 million papers indicates. And then the numbers here, where we're seeing over 80% and over 20% into the millions, indicates that there is a lot of AI writing usage out there around the world. Again, I remind you, I said AI usage, not AI misuse, because that's contextual and we can't determine that. But we can tell you that AI writing tools are being used at a very, very high rate around the world. Just like our similarity score, we do not advocate for sweeping judgments about students based on that single number. It's one piece of data for instructors and institutions to consider as part of an overall picture. It is a very important one, but we want to make sure that we call out that just like our similarity score, we do not recommend a good or bad number. We do not classify use versus misuse. We're simply giving insights to educators who can then use their expertise and their professional judgment, as well as their knowledge of their students, to make a determination about whether the usage is acceptable or not. Our job is to give you the information, and then we leave it to the professional educators working directly with their students to make a judgment call about whether something is or is not acceptable. We do want to call out that we are aware that there's a lot of concern out there in the media and among educators around this concept of false positives. We know that they happen. In fact, I'm going to ask, if they have not already done so, for my colleagues to share with you a link to a video from my favorite AI scientist, David Adamson, who does a wonderful job of explaining our data around false positives, how we handle them, how we guard against them, in the way that our AI writing indicator works. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that today because I really want to focus on the instructional side that we're moving toward. But we know that that's a concept that many people are concerned about, and we want to respect that. And that's why we've developed some resources around it, as well as that explanation from David. You can check out his video. One of the things that I value about the way that David is able to explain some of these concepts is that in addition to being an AI scientist, David is also a former educator himself. And you know, teachers, we love other teachers, but I think that David has a great way of explaining concepts to make them accessible for lay people. You don't have to be an AI scientist to understand the way that David explains these concepts. That's part of the reason that we really like having him help to sort of bridge the gap between AI scientists and regular people, so that we can all understand. All right, one thing I also want to call out for you is that we're aware that things are changing very quickly. You may notice this little watermark down here that says these data points are as of July 31st. So even these numbers will have shifted and need to be updated, because I'm sure that they have absolutely 100% changed in the time since July 31st. And that's the nature of where we are with AI writing, both at Turnitin and in the world as overall. The technology is evolving and advancing so fast that, frankly, it's difficult to keep up with it, which is why we want to partner with you to help you keep up with it and understand what the most current things are. So we are constantly refining our tools, refining our resources, even refining our messaging as things change in real time. Okay, so let's take a look at this indicator. As I said already, this is embedded in your similarity report. So for those of you who have access, you will already see, you'll see this indicator, and it shows up in this little box here. It is a number. It comes out as a percentage. And so everyone who has access to Turnitin currently has access to this. But remember, as I already called out, that changes as of January 1st. So make sure, if you aren't already talking to your account manager and you want to maintain access, that you reach out to your account manager in the coming days to make sure that you are able to maintain your access. So the way this works out is that it shows you this percentage. And again, that there's a very sophisticated way that we have of mapping that. We do guard carefully against false positives. And we also have a lot of faith in educators and students. And so we want to make sure that we are precise in our detection. So when our detection is not as confident, we will not highlight that. And that means that there may be AI written sentences that do not show up in this number. And we accept that risk because we believe that it is more important to really know and have confidence when we're telling you that there is an indication of AI writing, that we are absolutely confident that it is there. So there is a small proportion that won't show up if we're not 100% confident that it is AI writing. And we believe that that's the right way to conduct our business so that we are not falsely accusing students. So we're very careful about that. And so you will see, if you test out, that every once in a while we'll miss a sentence or a passage. And again, that's a risk that we have assumed and that we want to accept because we think that's the most fair way to treat students when there isn't that high degree of confidence that something is AI writing. So the basics of how this works, obviously for many of you, you will have seen this yourself, and so you know some of this. It's only visible to instructors at this point. You can download a report for students, but it is showing up in the actual instructor's workflow for them to see and then make a determination about what they want to do with that, whether they want to act on it, whether they want to have a conversation with students. That's what we recommend strongly. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. It does generate that percent score, and it highlights in the text the actual text that we believe is AI written. So that's sort of just a very, very basic rundown of how it works. Either in the chat or on our main AI landing page, you can see much more sophisticated in-depth coverage, and you can always schedule a demo with your account manager if you are interested in learning more about how the tool itself functions, the ins and outs, and any other questions that you may ask. All of our account managers are highly skilled in understanding how things work, and they can set it up for you and show you a demo anytime that you need one. The summary here is that, as I've said several times, but it bears repeating, this is not intended to be a judgment tool. One of the things I often say is when that number shows up, it's the beginning of a process, not the end. That's the point at which you instructors need to be having conversations with students about what is and is not happening in their work, and then make determinations about whether it is use or misuse, whether someone has strayed into misconduct or not. But the number itself is not the end of that process. It's not the judgment that we're passing on the student's work. As I said earlier, we believe that's the role of the instructor and the educators in conjunction with their students. You know your students, you know the parameters you set in your classroom, you know what is and is not acceptable for your particular class or even assignment, because it might vary from assignment to assignment. And we leave that judgment in your hands as the trained educator working closely with the student. What we're doing is providing you the data so that you can start a conversation with the student about what is happening in their work. As I already called out, we do want to be aware of false positives, but not alarmed by, because we have taken very significant measures to protect against and reduce the impact of false positives. Again, I know we've already shared with you David's video, and you can see a deep dive from him, as well as some other resources that are available on our website to really talk deeply about false positives. And as I already mentioned, you want to stay up to date with that website because things are changing rapidly, both for us at Turnitin as well as the AI technology in general. As those things evolve, we're going to respond and make sure that our resources are changing for you. So if you looked at this 2 months ago, I promise you, if you go and take a look at it today, there will be many, many new resources and new information there for you to find. It's worth regularly checking it out to see the updates. So now that we've talked a lot about sort of the general scope of artificial intelligence in the world, in academia, in your classrooms, let's talk about some practical tips and strategies for tackling this challenge in your classroom. This is my favorite part of the presentation. This is the place where I can get really passionate, and if I'm not careful, go perhaps too deep because I am so passionate about it. But we have a lot to share with you as we've learned a lot about both the technology, the impact on teaching and learning, as well as what we're hearing from customers around the world, what they're experiencing, what they're doing, what they're trying. And we want to make sure that we are sharing the best of that with you. And again, we're updating it very regularly. So I mentioned earlier that my colleague Callan down in Perth did a presentation several months ago. And when he looked at my presentation, he was like, oh, Patti, I wish that I'd included this or this, because there are so many new things evolving every day. And that means that our tips and strategies for you are evolving with the technology to make sure we're keeping pace with it. So let's dive into some of these practical tips and strategies. Before we get into the specifics, there's a sort of a core set of principles that we have to go into this with sort of at the front of our minds as we think about this. The first is understanding what academic integrity actually is. Now, if you are sort of a core disciple of academic integrity like I am, you probably spend lots of time looking at different research and definitions about what academic integrity is. But my buddy Callan found a fantastic definition that is very simple, but also sort of packs a lot of punch from our friends at the University of Melbourne. And their definition is that academic integrity is how we demonstrate good scholarship by being honest and ethical in our work, acknowledging the work and ideas of others. And so the most specific context that we're talking about here today is that idea of using your own words or acknowledging others. Now, today, when I talk about the idea of acknowledging others or citing your sources, I remind people that includes technology sources like ChatGPT. Again, we're not saying whether students should or should not use those tools, but for sure, if they are, they need to own that ethically and recognize and acknowledge it in their work and cite it. I do apologize, I have to pause for 1 minute. Have a little cold starting, so I need a cough drop. Okay, I think I'm back on track. The second principle that we want to keep in mind as part of our framework for understanding these practical tips and strategies is really to center the purpose of assessment. So when we think about assessment, we know that a sort of formal definition might be excuse me, assessment is an opportunity for students to demonstrate their skills, knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors in relation to a set of specific learning outcomes. Now, the way that I always talked about that to my teachers when I was a principal and a supervisor was that I would say that assessment is a representation of what students know, understand, and can do at a point in time. Just my way, sort of colloquial way of capturing it. Now, when we think about that, we have to remember when we're talking about assessment, we want to know what the student can do, what the student knows and understands. And so that's why it's very important for us to know when AI writing tools are being used, not to pass judgment on that use, but we have to keep it into consideration so that we are sure that our assessments are reflecting the student's knowledge and ability and not a supplemental set of tools unless we permit that use of tools. So it becomes really critical to the purpose of assessment that we know what is the student's own work versus what work is supported by other sources, other resources, other tools. So that's why it's important to keep that in mind as we talk about these tips and strategies today. The other thing we have to bear in mind is why students commit academic misconduct. Now, I could do a whole session on this topic because there are literally decades of research around why students commit academic misconduct. But if you do a survey of the literature, there are three primary reasons that pop up all the time, regardless of the research. One is a lack of awareness of what is and is not academic misconduct. One of the things that I always say is that if we leave it to students to fill in the blank, we can assume that they will not fill it in the way we would want them to, or certainly not doing so consistently, because they're not going to arrive at the same conclusions that we would as trained educators about what is and is not misconduct. So we have to move beyond assuming that they have the same shared definition that we do, and instead communicating it explicitly so that it is very clear to students what they are and are not allowed to do depending on the circumstances. So that lack of awareness about what academic misconduct is one of the number one reasons that students commit misconduct. The second reason is poor time management. This is that classic example of the student whose essay is due at 11:59, and so at 11:02, they are out of time and they haven't done the work, and they then are tempted by tools that make it easy to commit academic misconduct out of sheer panic in that moment. And so knowing that reality is driving some of this behavior is very important for us in terms of getting to the root cause and making sure that we're addressing that to head off some of these work. The third core reason that shows up in the research about why students commit academic misconduct is a lack of self-efficacy. So self-efficacy is tied to the concept of self-esteem and belief and confidence in your ability to perform a task. And what we know from the research is that if students are not feeling confident to perform well in a task, then they often will resort to some tools and temptations around academic misconduct and make poor decisions. So those are three of the primary reasons that show up across the body of research around why students commit academic misconduct. And those motivations play out differently in the classroom, and that will play into the strategies and tips we're going to share with you today. The last concept is your mileage may vary. Now, I'll be honest with you. When Callan shared this with me, I did not know what that phrase meant. It wasn't one I was familiar with, but once he explained it to me, it was so simple in its way of thinking that I thought I have to steal that and give him credit. So the concept behind your mileage may vary is that each and every situation is different. Whether you are at a large institution or a small institution, whether you work in one discipline versus another, maybe you are a humanities person versus a STEM person, maybe you have large class sizes versus small class sizes, maybe you are an adjunct versus a full professor. All of those variables can make a difference in where you are in time. And so the concept behind the idea of your mileage may vary means that you have to put this into your context. Everything I'm going to say today has to be put into context with where you are, where your work is, how much bandwidth you have, what your knowledge is. So you have to sort of give it a grain of salt and make sure that you take the advice and apply it directly to your circumstances in the ways that make the most sense for you. There's no one size fits all. I didn't believe that when I was a teacher myself, and I certainly don't believe it today. There are many, many different versions of how this may play out in your realm. And I think we have to keep that in mind as I go through some of these strategies and tips. This is just a little summary bubble that gives us some of the information that I've already shared with you. Just goes over the definitions we've talked about, and then just capturing those final ideas of always thinking about your own context when considering these tips and strategies. Okay, so once you have a general framework, I'm going to start with what I think are the most universal recommendations. That means that they should fit in most, if not all, contexts, depending on where you are. And all of these are really centered around communication and not making assumptions. I've already touched on that a little bit in the framework, but we're going to call it out very explicitly here. So the first general recommendation we make is to establish clear expectations and communicate them clearly. Now, how you communicate them can vary. It depends on the context of your classroom your personal instructional style and philosophy. I can share with you some of the ways that we're hearing that people are communicating these. We've heard about institutions and even individual professors who've created little videos that they're sharing, either on a main institutional resource page or as part of their online class, or even actually showing them in class and sending them out, whether it's via email or some other way that they're communicating them. Lots and lots of people communicating this and putting it on their syllabus. Other instructors are talking about it very actively in their classrooms. And what I would say is you can use any one of these tools or a combination of these tools to make sure that it is very, very clear exactly what your expectations are. In fact, we've even seen one of the ideas I loved most was creating a QR code and putting that on a poster that's displayed in a common area, because we know students love to scan QR codes. Even if they're not sure what it is, they'll scan it just out of curiosity sometimes. And if you can put resources there around expectations, whether that's in print or a video or even an audio file, that's a great way to sort of extend the conversation beyond the confines of your particular classroom to make sure that it's sort of everywhere. You want it to be as prominent as possible. Excuse me. So that's number one. The second bullet here is this idea of discussing ethical use of AI writing. It's really important that students have concrete examples of what is and is not ethical. And part of the reason I'm so conscientious about this is because if you remember at the very beginning of the presentation, I shared that one of my passions in education is the concept of equity. And so what I believe strongly and what historical precedent has borne out is the idea that if educators do not equip students to understand what is ethical and unethical use of AI tools, then many students who count on classrooms and educational institutions to deliver that kind of learning and prep and practice and guidance will not have access to it otherwise. And so they will enter the world of work where they'll be expected to use these tools for productivity as part of their day-to-day life, as well as part of their actual job, and they'll be ill-equipped to do so. And that will become an issue of equity because other students who have access to these tools outside of educational environments will be better prepared to use these tools, and it will widen a gap that already exists. And we know, again, from historical precedent, that when that kind of gap exists and persists, it is the most marginalized communities who have faced the effects of that to the greatest degree. So it's incredibly important that we make part of our instruction discussing the ethical use of AI writing tools. And then, of course, obviously, refer to and be consistent with your institution's academic integrity or AI writing policy. Hopefully, they have specifically called out AI writing as part of the academic integrity policy. But if not, the academic integrity policy itself can be interpreted and extrapolated for your classroom use to understand what is and is not acceptable for the institution, as well as your individual class and assignments. So absolutely critical. And again, these three suggestions are the suggestions that we think are most universal, regardless of how you're interacting with students, whatever context you're working from, these three can be applied almost anywhere. Getting beyond what is most universal, we want to bring in some findings from research. These are not our own recommendation, but in terms of those classroom conversations, there are a group of computer science academics from the University of California, Riverside, shared some findings about low effort misconduct reduction methods. And so some of their practical strategies dovetail to some of the ones we've already recommended, but go even further. First, they recommend discussing academic integrity for 20 to 30 minutes several weeks into the term. This was a very interesting finding because a lot of times academic integrity gets addressed in that very first days where you're establishing your class, your guidelines, maybe going over the syllabus. And a lot of times that's where instructors will choose to address the concept of academic integrity. But the findings from this group of computer science academics is that discussing academic integrity several weeks in is actually a better practice because you get past all of that massive, overwhelming wave of new information that comes at the very beginning. And that's when it is much, much easier to actually get it in front of students and have them sort of deeply take it in. It's also then possible to make a direct connection to specific assignments, whereas at the very beginning of the course, students have not engaged in any of that work yet. So again, their finding was 20 to 30 minutes, several weeks into the term. They also recommend requiring an integrity quiz with explicit do's and don'ts. I love this idea. And in fact, related specifically to the concept of artificial intelligence and AI generative tools, my team, the Teaching and Learning Innovations team, which is made up entirely of former educators, has created resources and a set of lesson activities to walk through some very specific AI writing tool scenarios with students to help them understand what is and is not acceptable. It's a great set of resources and gives you several very common sort of scenarios, as well as some talking points for how you can work with students to figure out, is this ethical? Is it not? How could you change this scenario to make it ethical? So it's a great series of learning activities. Not necessarily a quiz, but it does contain that very explicit concept of do's and don'ts and allows instructors to do that in a very concrete way, which can be really meaningful for students. And then in addition to talking about academic integrity early in the term, they also recommend returning to this conversation at midterm to remind students around the policy, the expectations, and any consequences that will come from that so that they can understand what's going to happen if they do stray into misconduct, to make sure that that's really, really clear for students. Again, in some cases, instructors will assume that students know what will happen, but in reality, it's often necessary for us to make that much more explicit for them so that they truly understand the sort of direct line between their actions and the potential consequences. The study also found that showing tools in class, actually demonstrating these tools for students and talking about how you use them in your grading and feedback process can be really, really valuable so that, again, students are not figuring it out for themselves. And we do have a number on our website, we have a number of videos that are actually targeted to students to help them understand the similarity checker that we already have, as well as the AI writing detector. And you can actually, these are just intended for you to push directly to students so that you don't have to come up with the explanation yourself. We try to make it as easy as possible for you to make sure that these videos get in the hands of students to help ensure that they're understanding what they look like, how they're used, what you do with them, what you don't do with them, etc. And then obviously normalizing help and pointing students to help resources. This goes back to this concept of understanding why students commit misconduct. And in many cases, it has to do with either a knowledge gap or a skill gap, like time management. So getting into the habit of pointing students to these resources and letting them know that not only is it okay, but you encourage them to use help, tutoring, supplemental resources, et cetera, to build up their skill set is really, really valuable for students in terms of a very low effort way to reduce any kind of misconduct. Now, specific to academic integrity concerns around AI writing tools is this concept. I'm sure many of you have heard about this. It shows up in nearly every article today that is published about AI writing tools. And it's this concept of designing or redesigning your assessment with these tools in mind. There are some super easy ways to do this. The first that a lot of people have recommended is actually sort of checking your assignment or your prompt against the AI generative tools and running your prompt just as you assign it through ChatGPT. What it can do for you is show you what kind of responses that exact prompt or assignment is going to get from a tool like ChatGPT. The way that I've talked to teachers about how they can think about this is that if you plug your prompt into ChatGPT and it returns a high score, then you know that your assignment is very vulnerable to students using this tool in place of their own thinking and their own work. What you decide to do at that point is obviously up to you. But once you do that, you at least know what kinds of responses can be returned. And that will give you a good idea of whether you need to change something or adjust something. When you start thinking about how to change your assignments or to change your entire assessment approach, there are a couple key areas that you can look at to do that. Now, the Teaching and Learning Innovations team here at Turnitin has designed some resources. Checking my time, need to pick up the pace. To help you through this process. We've created a checklist and a rubric. Notice these are intentional around AI misuse. The rubric is designed to really do a deep dive on the prompt itself. What do you need to change? And it encourages some best practices of writing instruction generally that are also helping to make your assignment less vulnerable to AI misuse. And they fall into 4 areas: student voice, critical thinking, sources and citations, and personalization. Those are all things that are harder for tools like ChatGPT, not impossible, but harder for ChatGPT to do. And so if you can tweak your assignment to include more of those elements, then you will understand how you can make your prompt less vulnerable to misuse. The checklist has a similar framework and even overlaps some with the rubric, but it focuses more on the process that you use around writing assignments and assessments in your class. Things like best practices like formative feedback and peer review along the way, opportunities for students to submit multiple drafts, those process pieces that, again, make the assignment less vulnerable to misuse. And I know that my colleagues supporting in the chat are sharing those resources with you directly, and we'll send them along as a follow-up to this webinar as well. We also talked a lot today about tough conversations around AI and how important those classroom communications are to preventing misuse. And so there are a number of ways that this process starts. Sometimes you just get a gut feeling that something is off. We've been recommending strongly that educators consider doing something of a diagnostic writing sample early in the term so that they have a baseline, maybe even doing that in class so that you have a little bit more oversight. And then using that as a comparison, when you get that gut feeling that something is off, you can go back and compare those two to see if you're seeing a very different writing style, a more sophisticated vocabulary, concepts that perhaps don't make sense compared to things that you've seen or heard from the student previously. Obviously, we're also going to recommend using the technical identification tools like our AI writing detector and gathering data points and documentation to inform the conversation. You don't want to go into the conversation just kind of winging it and making an accusation. So there's a careful way that you can prep for that. And you can prepare yourself and your students for these difficult conversations. And resources that hopefully we're sharing in the chat that you see here on the screen, we've created some resources that actually help you figure out how to go about having these conversations. So what is the documentation you need? What are some of the sort of discussion starters for these tough conversations? Because no one wants to have these conversations if you have a concern about misconduct, but you can approach it in a way that's going to sort of lower some of the barriers and make it a lot less likely that it will go horribly wrong. And we want to partner with you in that. And so we've given you some very deep resources that walk you through what this looks like. Incidentally, we also have versions of these for sort of non-AI related misconduct as well. You can find those on our website as well. And then finally, we have a main landing page that covers all of the resources I've shared so far, but it also has many, many more resources. The page is set up into 4 sort of categories. And again, we're adding to it and iterating on these resources constantly as things are evolving. So there's a section for professional learning resources, because again, if you look back to the survey data we shared at the beginning, a lot of students and our instructors and educators have not used these tools or don't know a lot about them. And so the first piece of this is educating the educators to make sure they understand these tools. And so there's a lot of professional learning resources. There's a whole section. There's also a section of educator resources, as well as instructional resources and student-facing resources that can be shared. As I mentioned earlier, we see a lot of institutions are actually sharing these broadly on sort of campus-wide resource pages or at tutoring centers, et cetera. So that's another great idea. So some of our key takeaways today, I want to remind you that the AI indicator is currently available in the similarity report for all of our solutions, but remember that that is changing as of January 1st. So if you have not already talked to your account manager, please make sure that you find some time to do so that you don't lose access to the indicator. Originality, Turnitin Originality or Feedback Studio with Originality is where the AI writing indicator will live beyond January 1st. I want to call out for you that there's a lot more to Originality than just the AI indicator. Specifically, inside Originality, you get access to Turnitin Draft Coach. Speaking to that concept of the process you use with writing, using a more formative process with feedback along the way. Draft Coach is a wonderful tool to support that because it does give students access to automated feedback on a number of different topics about similarity, about citations, about grammar. So there's a lot of great information in Draft Coach. Again, it's a student-facing tool, so it really can help you to deal with the scale of getting feedback to students. Obviously, that can be really overwhelming and daunting for a single instructor with lots of students. Draft Coach actually helps you in that regard because you don't have to return all of that formative feedback, but students still get iterative feedback multiple times in these different areas to help them sort of refine their writing. Again, thinking back to some of the root causes of academic misconduct. So this is just a little bit of a summary for today. I'm not going to read it all to you, but one thing I do want to call out from this slide, well, 2 things actually. Number 1, there are a lot of simple things that you can do. AI writing is somewhat scary because it is exciting and overwhelming, but there's a lot to it and you have a lot going on already. So please check out our resources and consider some of these very simple ways that you can start to address the potential misconduct in your class, and also start to think about how to teach students how to use these tools effectively and ethically. We want you to explore the indicator, particularly while you have it available in the preview version. And we also want you to talk to us and to other educators about what you're seeing and what you're doing. With that in mind, we would love for you to join the Turnitin Educator Network. It's an online community forum where you can talk to colleagues around the world who are dealing with some of the same situations and challenges that you are. And our teams at Turnitin also regularly post content and engage in discussions inside the Educator Network. So you have sort of real-time access to some of our experts as well as your colleagues from around the world. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, remember that we are here to support you. So please keep in touch with your account manager or those of us who are working on some of the resource sides, or even folks who are doing training and conducting seminars like this one on a regular basis, because a lot is changing fast and we would love to help you keep up with it. So thank you. As I predicted, we do not have time for a live Q&A, but I know that my colleagues have addressed many of your questions along the way. And if you have any remaining questions, we will be happy to follow up with you afterwards. I do appreciate your time today, and I hope that you will stay in touch with us and join some of our follow-up activities, as well as our Turnitin Educator Network. Thank you all.